Hi, it's Kim from Embodied Connections Australia, and I wanted to answer the fantastic questions that were asked by Gus. So, thank you so much, Gus, for asking these questions, following on from the last video I did about do you need to use a funeral director if someone dies? And for those of you who've watched that video, and you will see that the answer to that question is no, you don't have to. There's absolutely no requirement to do that. But, Gus, in response to your questions about if someone dies in Australia who was originally from overseas and they wanted to be buried back in that country of origin, do they, what happens and how does that all work? So in that regard, the answer is that is when you absolutely, one of those situations, do need the help and assistance of a funeral director, because every country is different, every country has different laws, every country has different cultural requirements. And so, as well as having a funeral director in Australia, if someone dies in Australia, they need to liaise with the consulate of the particular country that the person wants to be repatriated or have their body repatriated back to, and there needs to be a funeral director in that country to actually accept the body. So there's a lot of moving parts in that situation. So I would absolutely recommend that you do engage a funeral director, and preferably one who has affiliations or understands the process of what it takes to work overseas, because they will need to, as I said, liaise with the consulate. They will need to liaise with the funeral director in that other country. They need to organise all the paperwork. They need to organise flights, and there's quite a lot involved if that were to happen. And it can be a very, very lengthy, a very involved process to make all of those arrangements and to get everything happening. And depending on the country, on the particular country, it could take less than a week to get everything organised, but it could easily take several weeks or a couple of months. And so in that respect, as well, for someone who is travelling overseas, it becomes really, really important to really check your travel insurance and to make sure that your travel insurance doesn't just cover you if you were to have an accident while you were away travelling overseas and needed to go to hospital and needed some sort of medical treatment, but if you were to die in that particular country while you were over there, it's really, really important to check your travel insurance and make sure that it would cover the cost of having your body brought back to Australia, because it can cost well over $10,000 without the funeral costs then on top of that. So it is really, really important to just make all those arrangements. And it's another reason why, as I said in my previous video, it's important to start thinking about what sort of a funeral you would like and to start letting your wishes be known, because there's all of these other complicating factors that, for example, normally, again, most people take it for granted that you would need to be embalmed, and that's why you would use a funeral director, because they would have to embalm the body. But there's no need. Embalming is only to preserve the body between the time of death and up until the funeral, so that decomposition doesn't set in. But you absolutely don't need to embalm the body. It's quite possible to keep the body, and in the last video when I talked about home funerals, it's very, very possible to keep the body at home for up to 5 days, provided that the body is kept cool. And that can be done by being kept in an air-conditioned space. It can be done by hiring a cooling plate, and so that will also preserve the body. So there's absolutely no need to have a body embalmed. And that becomes really relevant if you're wanting to have a green funeral or a natural funeral, because some places, some cemeteries that have green funerals, they don't want those embalming chemicals going into the soil. And the reason that I'm talking about embalming is because that's also something to think about. If someone dies in Australia and they want their body taken back to another country, or conversely, if an Australian person dies overseas and they want their body returned home, then that is where legally the body must be embalmed, because airlines will not transport a dead body unless it's embalmed. And so again, it's really important to start to understand these things and to really have these conversations, preferably with a death doula such as myself, or a funeral director, or somebody who can really walk you through all of these processes and discuss your options with you, because it's really important that you have a very clear understanding and a very clear plan in mind, because if all of these decisions have to be made on the spur of the moment when something does happen, it's really, it's not the ideal time for someone to be having to try and understand all of these concepts and try to make all of these decisions. So it's really important that, as I said, check travel insurance if you're traveling overseas, understand what sort of a funeral someone has, understand what the possibilities are and how that's going to impact what their choices are. And so in terms of also talking about cremation or burial, so again, if someone were to die overseas and was coming back to Australia, there's nothing legally that prevents or regulates ashes coming back into the country. But again, it's really important to make sure that the container that those ashes are in isn't made of wood, because then you've got other customs and border issues that could come up. If, however, a body is coming back, as I said, there's requirements that it needs to be embalmed for a start. There's certain requirements in how it has to be transported for, it's really the requirements of the airlines, as well as any legal or cultural requirements in the country. So I'm sorry, Gus, that I don't have a more straightforward answer for you. And in some ways, what I have provided is probably a non-answer, because it is, as I said, it's not cut and dried, it's not clear cut, because it really depends on the country, it depends on their requirements, it depends on what sort of a funeral you want to have at either end, as to how the other transportation and legal requirements are going to impact the ability to do that. And it depends whether, again, you're looking at a cremation or bringing the human remains back and having them dealt with either in Australia, if it's an Australian person that dies overseas, or in, if it's someone from another a country that dies in Australia who wants to go back to their original country. Then there's a lot of moving pieces, there's a lot of things that have to be considered. So I would absolutely recommend in that situation that you do engage the services of a funeral director. But even before it gets to that point, that you really sit down and have a conversation with someone who does understand these things and can, as I said, walk you through all the different scenarios and make sure that it's all going to fall into place as best as it is possible to do that. So I hope that helps. And as always, please get in touch if you want to chat about this further. And if anyone else has any other questions, like Gus's great questions, I would love to hear from you. So much love until next time. Thank you. Bye.